Welcome to tonight's Enfield Voices webinar. I'm Katy Davis and I'm joined this evening by James Cracknell, who is the editor of Enfield's new free newspaper, Enfield Dispatch. So thanks for joining us this evening, James.
Right.
If perhaps you could just start by telling us a bit about how the new paper came to be.
Briefly, Enfield Dispatch is published by Social Spider Community Interest Company, which already publishes two newspapers in northeast London, Waltham Forest Echo and Tottenham Community Press. And they're run on a not-for-profit basis. They're monthly, they're free. And because those newspapers are moderately successful, we wanted to launch a third one. And I live in Enfield, and when the Enfield advertiser closed about a year ago, I said to my boss, David Floyd, who runs Social Spider, I said, look, if we're going to open a third newspaper, it should be in Enfield. And that was about a year ago. So we made it happen, basically, and we just published it at the end of last week.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry I wasn't actually able to be at the launch. It looked like a great evening, and that was done in association with Love Your Doorstep. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how that came to be.
Well, funnily enough, this is probably quite a good plug for Enfield Voices, because I actually went on to Enfield Voices in about May, and it was around the time that the change of the leadership at the council happened, shortly after the election, and a lot of people were talking on Enfield Voices saying, well, what's going on? We don't know what's happening. This is all very confusing. And I went on there and said, yeah, it is confusing. I don't know what's going on. And it's a shame that we don't have, what I would say is a sort of an effective local newspaper to publicize what was happening. And so I just sort of whimsically said, look, I work for an organization that does publish newspapers, and if anyone wants to maybe help us, we might be able to make it happen. And Emma Rigby from Love Your Doorstep replied to that message and expressed an interest. She's very enthusiastic, and we had a meeting in May. And then we sort of got on with the job of making the newspaper, and then sort of later on we ended up coming to a sort of a partnership agreement with Love Your Doorstep to share an office with them, and they're also helping to publicise us, so we're very grateful for that as well.
Fantastic. And I've seen the first issue. It looks really great. It's really nice to have a very local focused newspaper, because obviously we do still have the Enfield Independent, but since that's merged with Haringey, it's kind of taken away that very specific local focus. So I understand it's published in both electronic format and hard copy. So how can people get hold of a copy if they want one?
Yeah, so it's 10,000 copies, but because it's free, you won't find it in newsagents. So you might think, oh, I can pick up a copy in a newsagent. Unfortunately not, because newsagents don't like to stock newspapers that are free. So what we actually do is we distribute it through a sort of variety of methods. Some lucky people will have got one outside their local train station, because we have done a few copies outside there, some of the train stations in Enfield. But really the best way to find it is to go onto our website. We've got a Google map. So if you go on our website, which is enfielddispatch.co.uk, on our menu, there's a tab that says pick up. You go on there and there's a Google map. And the Google map has a list of around 200 locations where the paper is stocked. And these locations tend to be cafes, coffee shops, pubs, doctors' surgeries, hair salons. All 17 of Enfield's libraries stock it, and they actually have they have a big chunk of newspapers, so that should be a guaranteed place to get it, is your local library. Yeah, basically that's the best idea, is to go onto the Google map.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And obviously the response seems to have been very positive so far. I think some people might be wondering about, as it's a free local newspaper, and as we know, a lot of local newspapers have closed just because they don't have the kind of funding. How are you managing to achieve that with Enfield Dispatch?
That's a work in progress. I mean, making money out of local news is obviously not an easy thing. The key difference for us compared to the Enfield Independent or your other traditional local media is that we're not for profit, and the big difference that makes is that we're not desperately trying to make enough money to pay shareholders, and that sort of relieves a lot of the pressure. And it means that you can sort of relax and say, look, basically what we want to do is break even. If we can break even, that's great. But really, the aim is just to make sure that we've got enough money to make a newspaper that is something that is valuable to the local community. So, the aim is to make a great newspaper. We want to break even, but we're sort of fortunate because we're a social enterprise, community interest company. We actually have other sources of income, but that's not to say that if the paper makes a huge loss, then that's going to be a big problem for us.
Yeah.
But the primary source of income will still be advertising. We do need advertisers. At some point very soon, we're also going to have a membership scheme. Unfortunately, I can't say to you right now that you can sign up and become a member because we've been so busy making the newspaper, we haven't had time to create the membership scheme, but that will be there within hopefully a couple of weeks' time. We'll have a membership scheme so people can then support the newspaper that way by paying a regular amount per month.
Okay, fantastic. And I think lots of people will be interested in that actually, because I think it's really important we do have that kind of local newspaper available to us. So I think a lot of people think it's worth it if that's what we're getting as the end result.
Yeah.
If advertisers are watching now and they want to advertise in Enfield Dispatch, how can they get in touch with you about that?
So we've got a salesperson who's selling advertising. The details are on page 2 of the paper. If you've got a copy of the paper, bottom corner of page 2, you can find the person to call. You can also go on our website. So again, that's enfielddispatch.co.uk. And again, there's a little tab on our menus that says advertise, and you can find all the details there.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit more about the content that's gone into the paper. Can anybody submit articles or suggest ideas, or do you have a sort of team of people you've got working on it?
Yeah, again, so that's something that we do a bit differently to your traditional newspaper. Your traditional newspaper will have a team of journalists going out and writing stories. We don't have that because we operate a very low-cost model, and again, we're not for profit. But what we do instead, the model that we found to be successful, is actually where you have, if someone emails in and says, I've got a local project that I'm running, or I've got a campaign, I've just set up a petition, something like that, I'm hosting an event, then we will have a little discussion, but essentially those people can actually write an article themselves. And I actually think, in our experience, you actually get a more interesting article by doing it that way, because the person who's writing about what they are doing themselves is always going to have a more interesting things to say about it, and they can talk about their background, and they can talk about what they're doing in the community, and it might be that they're not going to be at the level of a professional writer, but they are going to have the experiences, and the stories that they can tell are actually more interesting. So yeah, essentially, the paper is probably about 80% written by local people who are doing things in the community.
No, that's really good. I think that probably makes it more relevant and gives that slightly more personal insight. One of the questions we've had from one of our viewers, and don't forget that you can submit questions either on the chat on the Zoom webinar or by sending them in under the comments page on Enfield Voices, is do you think there's any unique challenges of covering Enfield as a borough?
Yeah, it's a big place, because it's like the size of a city, sort of like Nottingham or Coventry. It's the 4th largest borough in London by population, and also geography. It's big. It's an outer London borough, and there's most people in Enfield will be aware of the sort of east-west divide. A lot of people seem to think that A10 is sort of this great big sort of barrier, basically in the demography of the borough. So yeah, but you know, you get that in a lot of London boroughs. To be honest with you, I've worked in different London boroughs, and they all do tend to have that sort of inequality there. Um, but you know, I think Enfield is a great place. I think it does have its own character, which not every London borough has. I think it does have an identity, and we're gonna, you know, do our best to, you know, reflect that in the paper.
Fantastic. So just to move on to a few more general questions, because people will also be interested in your background, James. And what is it that sort of first inspired you to get involved with journalism?
So that goes back a long way, actually. Believe it or not, I've been a journalist for going on nearly 12 years.
Okay.
And I guess I've always just taken an interest in what's going on around me. Um, I've I've been reading newspapers since I was about 8 years old, and so that's just something that I've always liked to do. I think some people prefer to sort of tune out of the world around them because they find it maybe scary or intimidating. I prefer to know about exactly what's going on. Like, I want to know what are the big scary things that are happening in the world. I prefer to know that. So that, you know, I just sort of, that's just sort of in me. But then I've also always enjoyed writing. So when I was about 21, I suddenly realized, well, hang on, I take an interest in the world, and I'm a good writer. So if I combine those two things together, I can be a journalist.
Oh, great. So would you almost say that journalism is your way of kind of understanding the world?
Yeah, well, that's what journalism is. Journalism is trying to make sense of what's happening and then telling people about it. It's sort of providing a service to people. Um, you know, it's going out there, finding out exactly what is going on, talking to people about it, witnessing things, investigating things, and then taking all of that complex stuff and trying to communicate it in as clear a way as possible. That essentially is what journalism is.
And what advice would you give to somebody else who might be watching and thinking, oh, actually, that's something that appeals to me. How can I get involved in journalism? Where should I get started?
Well, if they live in Enfield, they can email me. And I, you know, I don't, I can give advice to people. I don't mind. I would like to hear from young people. If there are young people in Enfield who, you know, may be interested in getting involved in journalism, or maybe they're just writers, I would like to hear from them. There is actually a couple of people, I think, on page 8 and 9 of the paper. There's a blogger from Edmonton who's,
Okay.
who's written for us. So yeah, you can do that. I mean, believe it or not, like I say, it was sort of 10, 12 years ago I got involved in journalism, but journalism has changed so much in that time that the method that I used to get into journalism is perhaps not the same method that you would use now.
Sure. What would you say the main changes have been in that time period then?
Well, I guess it's kind of obviously social media, and the way that people read and digest their news now is people unfortunately have got used to getting it for free. They don't want to pay for it. So the whole concept of paying for a newspaper is not a concept that young people have now. You know, my dad would always, you know, go to the shop in the morning and pay 50p for a newspaper, but I feel like that's a sort of a lost thing now almost. So that's a change that, you know, if my, you know, if we're not able to overcome that, then that's a big problem. We have to think of ways to overcome that to bring news to people.
Yeah, I suppose that's the other thing. People often assume that everything needs to be instant now as well. I think that's probably the other main thing with online, Twitter, RSS feeds, social media. I suppose some people might question altogether, what's the need? Why do you still need hard copy newspapers, and how would you respond to that?
So I think what we've been able to show by producing the newspapers that we do, Wolf and Forest Echo, Tottenham Community Press, and now Enfield Dispatch, we've been able to show that actually there is still a desire for printed newspapers, particularly local printed newspapers. And I think that's because you can reach a different audience. You know, as I was saying at the start, the way that we distribute 10,000 copies and we're putting those copies into coffee shops and cafes, that is a way of reaching people that actually the internet doesn't do the same thing. When you're on the internet, if you're only publishing news on the internet, you're competing against everything else on the internet, which means if what you've got is a story about Enfield, you're actually having to compete for people's attention with cat videos on YouTube, or anything else that could potentially be going on around the world. You're competing for people's attention with your story about Enfield, which doesn't help you as a local newspaper. Whereas with a print newspaper, you can put it in front of people's faces when they're having a cup of coffee or when they're waiting in the waiting room at their local GP surgery. You can put it there in front of them and they can pick it up. And there's no barriers to that. So that's why we think it still works. And the feedback that we get is that people really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think also sometimes probably it sometimes feel like there's too much information online. Almost you don't know where to go or how to filter through it. So perhaps having it there in the hard copy is another way of kind of knowing that's a verified source that you can go to without having to filter out some of the rubbish, perhaps.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah, there's obviously, unfortunately, increasingly so, people don't trust what they read, particularly on the internet, and there's varying reasons for that maybe not one to go into now, but if there's declining trust, you have to think of a way, how can you regain people's trust? And again, I think printed newspapers is a way to do that, and hopefully we can.
Although, I mean, having said that, there's been a bit of a thread on Enfield Voices this week about the kind of accuracy of the press and perhaps some of the accusations made against certain political leaders were perhaps biased or not entirely accurate. I think especially with also the Levinson inquiry, there's maybe an impression that there's a just general distrust in newspapers and the mainstream media today. Do you think they can overcome that, or what reforms would you like to see?
I mean, that's a big question. I mean, a lot of that is to do with unfortunately still this problem you have with certain sections of the mainstream media, that they have effectively shot themselves in the foot by eroding people's trust with the hacking scandal, with things like Hillsborough, and when these things haven't been reported properly, really they only have themselves to blame. But then on the other hand, we did have this big period about 5 years ago where we sort of reassessed how to regulate the media industry, and we had something called Levinson, the Levinson report, and part of what Levinson recommended was implemented, and part of what he recommended wasn't implemented, and I think it's now sort of been sort of forgotten about, and for whatever reason politically it's sort of been shoved under the carpet, and I think that's disappointing, and I think we perhaps need to look again, because a lot of the problems that were there 5-10 years ago with the hacking scandal, a lot of those problems haven't been solved.
I think one of the observations I made, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, is that I feel that a lot of the media have moved towards kind of being driven by emotion rather than by fact. There doesn't seem to be that much objectivity, and I mean, to be fair, you can never be entirely objective, I guess, that one way or another you've always got some kind of angle or some kind of personal bias, but presumably you try and eliminate that as much as possible as a journalist, unless you're writing an opinion piece, of course.
Well, so it's about your starting point. A lot of the newspapers that you would pick up in the newsagent, they very clearly and obviously have an agenda. So their starting point is, look, before we even begin to report on this thing, our agenda is that we want to make such and such political party look bad, or we're out to get a particular political person, we're out to get them. So they have an agenda to start with, and then it's sort of downhill from there. But if you basically have a starting point, instead, if you were to have a starting point and say, look, our only goal is to report fairly and accurately, then you eliminate that immediately, and then you can go about doing your job. And that's not to say that you might then you might make a mistake or you could do something wrong. But if at least your starting point is that you're setting out to be fair and accurate, then you're gonna have a much better product at the end of it.
And so do you think the newspapers can regain the public's trust?
I think they can. It's more about whether they want to. If we're talking about the mainstream media, it's really about whether they want to, because the people who own a lot of the big newspapers in this country, they don't want to. They actually don't care about those sorts of things. What they care about, again, is their agenda, and that's a big problem. And that comes from media ownership and the ownership models that we have. And if I can bring it back to Enfield Dispatch, that's why we're trying to do something a bit different here and say, well, our ownership model, we're not trying to pay shareholders. We're not for profits. There's no money motive there beyond breaking even, and literally our only aim is to provide something that is valued by people in Enfield, is fair and accurate information, and is a platform for local people that is valued by local people, and that's our only aim.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. That's really good to hear. And I think lots of people are really going to get behind this venture. I suppose, having just said that about all of the mainstream media, but do you have any particular heroes as journalists? Is there anyone who you particularly admire as a writer?
Yes, my journalistic hero is George Monbiot. He writes in The Guardian, but I mean, he's best known as a columnist, but he is a journalist in the true sense of the word, because he exposes things that other journalists don't expose. I mean, he's been to Indonesia, he's been to Africa. He almost died in Africa when he was younger. So he's been there and done it as far as journalism goes. And I admire him because he frequently writes things that when I read it, I think that I agree with that totally, but I've never quite been able to express that. And then he expresses it in a way that is really easy to understand. And that, again, that's the mark of a good journalist.
And finally, what's your ultimate ambition as a journalist? Would you like to work for a larger newspaper, or do you just want to expand your group of local newspapers? Where would you like to see yourself?
So if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, then I would have said, yeah, my aim is to write for one of the big newspapers. And a lot of my friends have done, a lot of my journalism friends have done, but I've actually I feel like I've found the thing that I really enjoy doing now. Being able to produce something like Enfield Dispatch, I have a lot of control over it, and I'm able to sort of I'm not sort of having to defer to a boss who is ordering me to do such and such. And I really value the sort of having the openness of the freedom to be creative and to be able to put something together and then have an end product that I know is sort of that I can be pleased and proud of. So I would say my goal is almost what I'm doing now is what I really enjoy.
Okay, that's great. So everyone's probably wondering, we've just had this issue, so when will the next issue be out? How frequently can we expect to see our issues of Enfield Dispatch?
So it's a monthly newspaper, so next month. Is there
a particular day of the week that we should expect it?
Well, I mean, if people want to make a note of this, it basically goes to print on the last Thursday of each month.
Okay.
Which means that you can then pick up the paper starting from the last Friday of the month. But generally speaking, unless you're sort of really impatient, generally speaking, you can pick up the paper from, the first week of the month. You can find it.
Okay, well, we've had one final question actually on the Facebook feed. Is there any additional participation you might want from Enfield Voices? Is there anything we can do, or any of the other community groups that you're looking that we can help in terms of helping out Enfield Dispatch?
I'm not sure. Like I really like Enfield Voices, and it's a really good platform to have. It's really good for communicating with local people. I think there might be ways we can work together. I don't know if I've had enough time to really think about the ways
Sure.
that we could work together, but um, certainly at the moment, you're being really helpful in promoting what we're doing, and having this interview is incredibly valuable. And I think a lot of people have been able to find out about the paper that wouldn't have done otherwise. Um, you know, basically, if people want to get involved in the paper, the best thing to do is email me. If you have an idea for an article, let me know. Um, I should say that there are things such as lists. We have a listing section. So if you've got an event, you can submit a listing for that. For the next edition, something we don't actually have in the first edition. In the second edition, I want to make sure we have a section of the letters.
Okay.
So if there are people who want to just sort of sound off about a particular issue in Enfield, obviously it needs to be relevant to Enfield,
Sure.
but if you want to write a letter of up to 200 words,
Okay.
you send that to me. The next deadline I should mention is the 17th of October. So that's our deadline for all article submissions, and that goes for letters and listings as well.
Okay, I will make sure we post it on Enfield Voices as well, so that people know. So just to finally sum up, could you just want to summarise all the contact details for yourself, so if anyone's watching?
Yep. Okay. You can find these contact details on page 2 of the paper, but basically the email address is enfielddispatch@socialspider.com. We're based at Salisbury House, obviously sharing an office with Love Your Doorstep. So if you do want to post anything to me, although it's not very often people do post things these days, but the address for that is Salisbury House, Berry Street West, Enfield, N9 9LA. The best phone number is 020-8521-7956.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, James. And that's been a really interesting interview, and we're all behind this new venture, and we look forward to seeing the new issue.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been really good. Thank you very much.